J'ouvre maintenant.
I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 14 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Committees. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, January 31st, 2022, the committee is meeting to study the state of Canada's supply chain. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid form. Pursuant to the House Order of November 25, 2021, members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom.
On March 10th, 2022, all those attending the meeting in person must wear a mask except for members who are at their place during proceedings. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefits of the witnesses and members before we begin. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor audio, English or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use your raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. Colleagues appearing before the committee today, we have Monsieur Serge Bay, Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Ferry Association. From the Chamber of Shipping, we have Robert Louis Manning, President. From Food and Beverage Canada, we have Kathleen Sullivan, Chief Executive Officer. From l'Institut de Recherche en Économie Contemporaine, nous avons
We have Hubert Rioux.
Cisco Canada, we have Randy White, President. And from Walmart Canada, joining us in the hall with us today, we have John Bayliss, Executive Vice President and Transformation Officer, as well as Francis Lalonde, Vice President, Transportation. We will now begin with the opening remarks with Walmart Canada. Gentlemen, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, members of the committee. First and foremost, really want to thank you for the opportunity to testify on the state of Canada's supply chains. My name is John Bayliss, Chief Transformation Officer of Walmart Canada, and with me today is my colleague Francis Lalonde, VP of Transportation. Now, Walmart Canada, one of the country's largest retailers, Francis and I are responsible for overseeing our supply chain network and transportation strategies. As you know, we operate coast to coast to coast, employing over 100,000 associates across Canada. It's our job to ensure supply chains function efficiently so that Canadians can save money, live better, and have access to the products they want, most importantly, when they need them. As the world's largest integrated supply chain, that responsibility has never been more apparent than in these past 2 years. It's fair to say world events, changing customer expectations, and new growth opportunities have necessitated a major investment in our Canadian supply chain. That's why in the summer of 2020, only 3 months after the start of the pandemic, we committed over $3.5 billion into our store and supply chain infrastructure, making flagship investments across the country in Surrey, Calgary, Cornwall, Vaughan, and Moncton. As a proud Canadian, I'm very proud that this investment is our most ambitious investment program since our arrival in Canada over 25 years ago. Walmart is on a journey to become also a regenerative company. That means we're aiming to use our size and scale to make a positive impact. And given the impact of supply chains on the environment, we see a sustainable supply chain as foundational to our long-term competitiveness, as well as a catalyst for clean growth and long-term strategic advantage. Part of this, we're also committed to becoming carbon neutral globally without the use of offsets by 2040. And right here in Canada, we're very proud that we've committed and on a mission to deliver on our promise to be 100% alternatively powered in our fleet by 2028. Given our experience in global and domestic infrastructure, we're grateful for this opportunity to address the committee today and share recommendations on how to improve the resiliency and efficiency of Canada's supply chain. I'll turn over to Francis Lalonde to go into further detail. Francis.
Merci, John.
Thank you, John. I'd like to deal with my remarks in terms of recommendations in 2 areas, the workforce supply and infrastructure. During the pandemic, Canada was faced with a significant shortage of workers, and that situation has only gotten worse. As one of the premier employers in Canada, we're aware of the fact that Canada needs to make investments in infrastructure and in the supply chain, but we are not able to invest enough in manpower, and if not, then we are going to have difficulties. We know that the first step is immigration. We recommend that the government explore the possibilities of attaching priority to supply chain and logistics positions, working with provincial programs to attract world talent to Canada. It's essential because many employments in Canada are in the work chain, the supply chain, are very important and also deal with the slowdown of the growth rate. Immigration is only part of the situation. It is only a part of the solution as well. Acquiring people to work and to become drivers costs some $10,000 to $15,000 in training per person. These are very significant training costs. It's very important that if there's a government program, the funding be given to the individuals and not to the businesses. That will allow for mobility of the workforce, flexibility of careers, competitiveness, and reduced financial obstacles. Also, recent events have shown us that our supply chain is very fragile. This is something that is putting increased pressure on businesses. We recommend that the government adopt a supply chain strategy which would take into account the future needs in terms of possible congestion, possible reduced transit time, and also have a redundancy built into the infrastructure for our trade corridors. We have faced extreme weather situations, and so we are trying to establish a guide with the United States that would allow for real-time response for emergency transporter applications. Walmart, this is essential. Walmart Canada is ready to work with the government to ensure that supply chains remain resilient. I'll be happy to answer any question you have.
Next, from the Canadian Ferry Association, we have Mr. Serge Bai, Chief Executive Officer. Mr. Bai, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. The ferry sector is definitely critical to Canada's supply chain. Annually, CFA members transport 55 million passengers, 22 million vehicles, and billions of dollars of goods. Ferries connect urban, rural, remote, and indigenous communities in every region of the country. Importantly, ferry services communities that are not adequately serviced by other mode of transportation, making them a vital link in supply chains for ferry-dependent communities. For example, Inuvik relies on ferry services to transport goods into the town and surrounding communities during warmer months. Ferries can bring in goods that cannot be safely transported over ice roads. Clearly, Newfoundland and Labrador and Vancouver Island are also serviced by our members. And you can find examples throughout the prairies, northern Canada, and the rest of the country. Disruptions to regular ferry services can significantly impact supply chain. Delayed or canceled sailings can result in delayed deliveries to businesses. In extreme situations, this can result in shortages of fresh food, fuel, and other goods in ferry-dependent communities. Because ferries transport goods as well, primarily agricultural and seafood products from communities for domestic consumption or exports, making delays in sailings a problem for those communities who lose revenues. Indeed, disruption in ferry services can result in losses, for example, from the spoilage of fresh caught fish. It can also impact the broader supply chain and transportation networks. More goods may need to be shipped via air or land transportation. Truck traffic at ports can become more congested. Cargo at ports can back up. We believe that investing in the ferry sector can strengthen Canada's supply chain infrastructure in the face of crises like climate change. I would like to give an example of how the ferry sector has enhanced the resiliency of Canada's supply chain. The flooding that swept through BC last year severely disrupted supply chain and transportation networks when sections of major highways and some rail lines were submerged or damaged. On Vancouver Island, shortages of food and fuel were reported. Some people were stranded. To help bring in critical supplies and transport stranded people, BC Ferries ran extra sailings between Victoria and Nanaimo, as well as along their Brentwood Bay Mill route while the highways were being cleaned up. That is a clear example of how ferries can be part of the solution in some of those crises. But climate change indeed poses a major challenge for the ferry sector. Extreme weather events, erratic freeze-thaw cycles, flooding, erosion, and other consequences of climate change have introduced an unprecedented level of uncertainty and risk for ferry operations and infrastructure. Supply chain can also be impacted by prolonged cancellation of ferry services, an increase in delays or canceled trips, and reduced planning and logistical certainty. The prospect of rising sea levels and even more frequent extreme weather events threaten the long-term sustainability of the sector. To withstand disruptions and damage because of climate change, sustained strategic investment to adapt operations, vessels, terminals, and other supporting shore infrastructure will be needed. And that will also be needed to also reduce GHG emissions. The pandemic has also intensified the chronic labor shortage that have plagued the ferry sector for some time. I noted the representative from Walmart talked about infrastructure and labor. I'm talking about infrastructure and labor as well. We've had major challenges as a result of the pandemic. Transport Canada predicts 43% of the marine transportation workforce will retire in the next 10 years. On the ferry side, it will be much earlier. We also have an example as a result of the pandemic, examples throughout the country actually, of COVID-19 cases preventing ships from moving ahead. We've had that in Atlantic Canada, we've had that in the prairies, we've had that in Ontario and Quebec, and today the island of Haida-Gwaii on the west coast is being served by planes which have been taken by the ferry operator to serve the communities, because since Sunday, ferries have not been able to transport passengers in view of COVID outbreak in there. So some services, the pandemic has definitely caused a sharp decline in ridership and therefore revenues. The difficult decisions will need to be made in the future, and that could impact service delivery. Despite the sector being a critical link in Canada's supply chain, especially for ferry-dependent communities, the ferry sector is overlooked. The sector has been repeatedly excluded from infrastructure programs. There is no dedicated support for the sector to adapt to climate change or reduce GHG emissions. The sector needs a committed federal partner to address many of the critical issues facing the sector. Actually, the communities that are being served by ferries need a committed federal partner to address some of those issues. Canadians' supply chains need a reliable, affordable, and safe ferry service to deliver goods to domestic and international markets and to respond to shocks across the transportation networks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bai. Next, from the Chamber of Shipping, we have Mr. Robert Louis Manning, President. The floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And as you have heard, it's been a very challenging few years for supply chain partners, but Canada has successfully maintained international trade despite challenges posed by protests, the pandemic, and climate change events. This was achieved through collaboration with labor, engagement across supply chain actors, and federal departments that were receptive and adaptive to the needs of industries. Our recommendations today come from the perspective of international ocean carriers, ships that move approximately 60% of Canada's international trade, largely in Western Canada. Canada's supply chain is a complex regime of interrelated capabilities that are governed through commercial contracts, regulatory frameworks, and which utilize independent and shared infrastructure resources. In most cases, the dependency means that problems and therefore solutions must consider more than one asset or aspect or capability of the supply chain regime in order to be effective and avoid unintended consequences. Many witnesses before me have already made excellent proposals, such as the continued funding and allocation of resources from the National Trade Corridors Fund, a strategic review of the supply chain, and accelerated reviews of major infrastructure projects. In general, we have confidence that the government has heard these calls and will act upon them. I would like to leave you with some additional ideas. Firstly, with respect to intermodal cargo in containers, Canada should rapidly review regulatory process to facilitate the movement of containers through terminals that are not currently managing containers and create additional surge capacity. This will require additional mobile radiation detection capability at ports of entry to be managed by the Canada Border Services Agency. Secondly, with a severe shortage of industrial land in the BC Lower Mainland, the federal government should continue to support ports like Vancouver, acquire additional industrial land, either temporarily or permanently, to support the management of intermodal cargo and increase volumes. Managing cargo requires space, and it is a limited and valuable commodity. Thirdly, Transport Canada should facilitate the expansion of short sea shipping to support additional container capacity. While it might not have been economically feasible even 3 years ago, it deserves reconsideration on a regional basis. Fourth, Transport Canada should accelerate the efforts of the announced Supply Chain Task Force and put the onus on industry to identify supply chain inefficiencies. During the response period after the BC floods, Transport Canada facilitated dialogue, but it was the supply chain partners that developed short-term contingencies to address the delivery of critical supplies and the resumption of the service. It was very successful. Simply having all supply chain stakeholders provide input to regulators is not sufficient, nor will it result in timely actions and solutions. Fifth, Transport Canada and the Port of Vancouver should move cautiously with the development of its active vessel traffic management system. While this won't be known to the committee members, this is a complex initiative and it deserves a very deliberate approach that engages all supply chain partners. We cannot afford to get this wrong when the system is already operating suboptimally. And finally, Canada needs a national anchorage strategy to help manage surge capacity on the water, which is essential to ensure that the appropriate number and size of anchorages are available in less impacted areas to support Canada's ambition and periodic supply chain disruptions. Supply chain disruption not only impacts Canadian businesses and consumers, but also local communities and Indigenous communities. The vessel congestion experienced in the wake of the BC floods was significant and meant that an inordinate number of ships were seeking shelter in coastal waters. This unusual level of container ship congestion takes away much needed anchorage capacity and surge capacity for Canadian exporters of other commodities like agricultural and minerals. This type of situation is unsustainable, and we need the supply chain to be more productive and benefit all Canada's exporters and importers. 3 years of disruption has exposed systemic vulnerabilities that need long-term planning, strategy, and investment. It is likely that our supply chain will encounter further shocks, and the Government of Canada, provinces, and supply chain partners need to prepare for this inevitability. We need contingency plans that support the smooth resumption of service, which, as we have learned, can last beyond 6 months. In short, there likely isn't a silver bullet to alleviate the current level of supply chain congestion, but enabling and facilitating industry-led dialogue will accelerate short-term solutions, while longer-term solutions relating to supply chain resiliency are developed. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lewis Manning. Next, we have Ms. Kathleen Sullivan, the Chief Executive Officer of Food and Beverage Canada. Ms. Sullivan, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. My name is Kathleen Sullivan and I'm CEO of Food and Beverage Canada, representing Canada's domestic food and beverage manufacturing sector. I thank you for the invitation to speak today. Food and beverage is one of Canada's largest manufacturing sectors. Found in every province, the industry includes almost 8,000 manufacturers, the vast majority of which are small businesses. The sector employs at capacity almost 300,000 workers and is central to Canada's food supply, taking raw agricultural products from across the country and turning them into the foods you find in your grocery store, from bread to cold cuts, yogurt to canned vegetables, bacon to butter. Canada's food system is the foundation of this country's national food sovereignty. Our food system contributes to Canada's national, provincial, territorial economies. It supports our international trade goals, and it underpins local food production and food security. And the system is a complex supply chain. It connects almost 200,000 farms, 8,000 food and beverage manufacturers, 15,000 retail stores, and 100,000 restaurants, all working together and with input suppliers and the transportation sector to ensure that Canadians like us have the food we need. For the past 2 years, Canada's food supply chain has been under inordinate and destabilizing pressure. Today, more than 90% of Canadian food companies are experiencing supply chain issues. And a recent survey of my members listed supply chain disruptions among the top 3 issues impacting the sector, along with labor and competitiveness. The reasons for supply chain disruptions are complex and include interruptions in global supply chains due to the pandemic, price inflation, natural disasters, labor shortages, and transportation infrastructure disruptions. Just a few examples. First, last November, flooding in BC had a significant impact on the food supply chain, both within that province and also outside of it. The province, which is responsible for 9% of Canada's food processing, experienced the closure of highways, rail service, and roads as a result of flooding. Transportation backups, driver shortages, along with infrastructure barriers impacted the ability to move product from distribution centers and processing facilities to retail stores for consumers. Agriculture producers and food processors experienced significant strain due to the inability to secure animal feed and concern for animal welfare. As well, freight costs skyrocketed and in fact remain high compared to pre-flood levels. In March, a potential strike at Canada Pacific Railway, which of course turned into a very brief strike, raised significant concerns about the ways in which Canada's food system depends on a reliable transportation infrastructure to ensure that Canadians have access to the food they need. And most recently and tragically, the war in Ukraine has led to increases in the price of wheat and Canadian flour, with Russia and Ukraine combined representing almost 30% of the world's wheat exports. The most pressing concern for supply chain stability right now is labor. Food and beverage is the largest manufacturing employer in the country, but today Canadian food and beverage manufacturers are short 20 to 25% of their workforce, which is absolutely staggering. The labor shortage has resulted in a 20% reduction in domestic food output, and it's our expectation that these shortages will exist even after the pandemic and in fact become worse. As an example, we anticipate a quarter of the industry's workforce will reach the age of 65 in the next 5 years. Recent changes to the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, which Food and Beverage Canada was advocating extensively for, will absolutely provide some necessary and welcome short-term relief for Canadian companies as industry continues to work with government on longer-term measures to address labor issues. Work on a national workforce strategic plan for the agri-food sector in partnership with my organization, Canadian Federation of Agriculture, and the Canadian Agricultural Human Resources Council will also help to identify medium and long-term solutions to address our workforce challenges, and I think could be a blueprint for other sectors as well. And we would welcome the opportunity to continue updating you on the progress of that work. And finally, I do want to point out, as I noted earlier, that the vast majority of companies in Canada's food and beverage manufacturing sector are small businesses. And work on a code of conduct with Canada's grocery retail sector will also be, I think, very instrumental in helping to improve supply chain issues. In closing, I would like to acknowledge the dedication of everyone in Canada's food system over the past 2 years as they work to keep the food supply chain operating in Canada, not a small feat. Working together, they continue to ensure that Canadians have access to Canadian food. I look forward to your questions and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sullivan. Prochainement.
Our next speaker is Mr. Hubert Riault from the Institut de Recherche en Économie Contemporaine. You have 5 minutes, sir. Hello, and thank you. I'm representing the Institut de Recherche en Économie Contemporaine, an independent professional research organization that specializes in the comparative analysis of industrial, agri-food, and financial policies. Over the past 2 years, we have developed a research project on issues related to reindustrialization, relocation of production activities, and manufacturing import substitution. These are a very important part of the supply chains and the tectonic reconfiguration of the supply chains in the Western economy, which progressively have reversed the relocation to low-wage countries. We know that the just-in-time method that has been with us since the 1990s has been fueled by this. The international health crisis has obviously accentuated and accelerated this reconfiguration, and perhaps it has brutally highlighted the multiplication of risks that global supply chains will have to face. They are, for example, international financial crises, climate change, natural disasters, trade conflicts, and a resurgence of protectionism, geopolitical instability, mass migration, terrorism, and cyber attacks. Unfortunately, there was a vote in the House of Commons. Can Mr. Ryu continue with his presentation? Is nobody objecting? All right. Well, thank you very much. You may continue. I was saying that amongst these risks that I just enumerated, taking into account the recurrence of these risks, but also the progress linked to manufacturing automation, the McKinsey Global Institute estimates that by 2025, the price of transportation has gone up fivefold, and particularly in Europe. And the Asian American routes also have more than doubled. In that context, in the European countries and the U.S. have already put in place a range of initiatives to support shorter supply chains. During 2020, for example, the European Commission published 2 versions of the industrial strategy for Europe, one of whose main objectives is to strengthen the EU's strategic autonomy. Among other things, this policy proposes additional inter-firm networking initiatives, industrial alliances as well, that are aimed at substituting European supply and production for imports in several key areas. And in 2021, the Biden administration issued a report identifying 4 critical sectors where U.S. supply chains and production could be strengthened. Semiconductors, high-capacity batteries, rare earths, strategic materials such as lithium and graphite, and pharmaceuticals and their active ingredients. The Biden administration has also established a consortium to identify 50 to 100 strategic pharmaceuticals for which production should be relocated to the United States, at least in part. And several $1 billion in investments have also been announced to stimulate production and strengthen local agri-food supply chains. But considering the aggressiveness of the relocation policies implemented by Western economies in recent years, Canada has proven to be very conservative. Since the 1980s, and despite the realization of the health crisis, Canada's federal government has persisted in favoring a liberal approach to economic development with very little intervention and no industrial policy as such. This remains true 2 years after the publication of the report by the Industry Strategy Council. So Quebec, on the other hand, has been much more active in recent years in terms of industrial policies in general and in terms of policies promoting relocation and import substitution in particular. We have studied these efforts in detail. For example, automation in the plans, a carbon tax at the borders, platforms where there is a marriage between suppliers and producers on a local level, and many others that I could certainly, if you are interested in detail in answering questions.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Rio.
Given that the vote has been called, I propose, with your approval, that we conclude today's meeting with the introductory remarks from Mr. White, the President of Cisco Canada. Does this meet with your approval? Yes. Okay. Seeing no objection, Mr. White, the floor is now yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thanks for the opportunity to appear before you today with my industry colleagues. My name is Randy White, and I'm the president of Cisco Canada. Cisco Canada is a national leader in selling, marketing, and distributing food and non-food products to over 45,000 active clients in restaurants, healthcare, long-term care, retirement facilities, educational facilities, lodging establishments, and other food away from home businesses and customers. Our business model includes fresh, frozen, dry goods, produce, dairy meat, seafood, as well as paper products, food service packaging, and all other supplies in the industry. We are a major economic driver from coast to coast, and we employ over 5,000 Canadian associates operating out of 25 significant facilities, including our facility in Missur, Barcelou, Duval's riding. We deliver to every province and territory with a fleet of more than 600 trucks. In addition, we are proud participants in the Government of Canada's Nutrition North program, helping to deliver healthy, quality food products to some of the most remote locations in Canada. At Cisco, we are dedicated to delivering the highest standards of food safety, reliability, and quality in the food supply network in Canada and around the world. Our expertise is robust and very consistent with food supply chain management, and it is second to none. During the earliest days of the pandemic, as well as more recently with the challenges of the BC extreme flooding situation, Cisco was at the front of the line helping to solve supply chain problems and logistical issues to ensure people in the hardest hit regions were able to receive food and other supplies. We have the right expertise, the right experience, and we have the right resources to bring to the table to work with the Canadian government in helping look for solutions. Mr. Chair, this committee is studying Canada's supply chain management, and it's very timely. I would like to raise 3 specific areas where companies like ours need the Canadian government to support and help where possible. First and foremost, supply chain success is really about people. Our people at Cisco, our drivers, our warehouse associates, our teams are what allow us to get food from the farm to our customers across the country. And I know that we are not alone, as we're hearing about this today in many ways, that saying that the labor shortage is at an all-time high. In fact, here's a statistic. The latest quarter at the end of the last calendar showed that there were over 22,000 open truck driver positions across Canada. That number has continued to increase. It's an astronomical number. Across our network, we require more drivers, more warehouse associates, more employees in general to ensure we are able to continue servicing our clients, providing food in government settings as well as the private sector. We note the recent federal government's changes to the temporary foreign worker system announced earlier this year. However, at the top of this, what we really need, and we need it now, is speedier approval of applications to get these people into the system and into the general workforce and into our workforce faster than the current pace. The second item, and what we saw during the pandemic and certainly during the BC flooding, was a patchwork of regulations that actually hampered our ability to get food and other essential supplies across the country. For example, many of our drivers, the only way to get supplies into isolated parts of British Columbia were out of Canada and through the United States and back across the Canadian border. And unfortunately, in many cases, they were stuck at border crossings with understandable COVID regulation issues that changed sometimes by the hour. And they were applied unevenly. This led to unnecessary delays for food and supplies for Canadians who needed it desperately. With a minister responsible for emergency preparedness recently appointed, one of his priorities needs to be to work with the provinces to establish protocols to help cut unnecessary red tape and restrictions in these times of crisis. This is a very important point. Lastly, my third point, in Budget 2022, the government had noted the need for heavy-duty electrical vehicles to be part of the solution in the fight against climate change and the battle to get to net zero. Cisco Canada wants to participate in this goal. It is very well known that electrical vehicle tractor trailers are extremely expensive. We want to work with federal government and provincial governments to accelerate the adoption of EV transport equipment to help meet these targets. And given our track record in other countries and elsewhere, we would be a natural partner for the federal government in this challenge. These are some of my thoughts to put on the table today with the other thoughts, and I'm sure we can get to further discussion on this at some point in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, committee, and I look forward to engaging further on these ideas.
Thank you very much, Mr. White, and I want to thank all of the witnesses for being here today on behalf of all committee members for sharing your opening remarks. Unfortunately, as is the case very rarely, we will not be able to get to the line of questioning today. That being said, the clerk has indicated his sincere joy of working with you to try and ensure that we can get you on in subsequent meetings. I believe we have 3 meetings left where we'll be discussing and continuing our discussion on this issue. So we look forward to having you back and joining other witnesses to give our members opportunities to ask you questions. So thank you very much, everyone. This meeting... Oh, I believe we have a raised hand from Mr. Barcelo-Duval.
Yes, Mr. Chair. What explains the fact that we're not going to come back to the committee after the vote? Do you feel that there wouldn't be sufficient time, or that there's somebody else that needs the room? Well, yes, that's exactly right, sir. Unfortunately, the vote is going to be at about 5:15, and with the 10 minutes that we have to wait, it'll be at least 5:30 before the members come back here, and it's after the time that our meeting was scheduled to end. It's unfortunate, but thank you, Mr. Barcelo-Duval.
We're going to do it next time. We have until next Friday, unless you want to do it now. Okay. Mr. Badaway, you had a motion you wanted to put forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I may, we are looking at some future studies, and I'd like to get ahead of the game with respect to communicating to the liaison committee with respect to our travel plans into the fall season. We are looking at port expansion. We are looking at the port modernization studies. So I'd like to put a motion forward that in relation to the committee's study on large port infrastructure expansion projects in Canada, the clerk of the committee, in consultation with the chair, prepare a preliminary travel submission respecting the committee's proposed travel to St. John's, Newfoundland, Halifax, Nova Scotia, Montreal, Quebec, Hamilton, Niagara Region, Ontario, Vancouver, BC, Prince Rupert, BC, Seattle, Washington, in the States, and the Port of Rotterdam, Netherlands, in the fall of 2022.
Thank you very much, Mr. Badaway. Discussion, comments on that?
I support that motion, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Barcelo-Duval?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I don't have any intervention to make, but since my colleague brought forward a motion, perhaps I will have one as well.
Those in favor? All those opposed? Carried. Thank you, colleagues. Mr. Barcelo-Duval.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
In fact, my motion is a motion that deals with committee business for next fall. And it's a motion that deals with proposed travel that the committee, given the impact of commercial trade navigation in the area of Berchère and Masquinongé, should look at the shoreline as well and study that. I would suggest that the committee should do so. I hope that this will be considered as part of the travel for this type of problem. Questions and comments?
All those opposed? Carried. Thank you very much, colleagues, and thank you once again to our witnesses. This meeting is now adjourned.